is a neurotransmitter, which means that it is the molecule that allows the electrical signal from the presynaptic neuron to be communicated to the postsynaptic neuron, because there's a little gap called the synapse between those two neurons. So neurotransmitters allow fine-tuning of those electrical signals. And dopamine is the most important neurotransmitter involved in motivation and reward. And the fundamental difference between things that are addictive and those that aren't is that things that are addictive release a lot more dopamine. So we have dopamine firing in our brain that occurs at a tonic baseline. And when we do something that's rewarding or pleasurable, we get a little rise in dopamine levels or a spike. I define addiction as the continued compulsive use of a drug or behavior despite harm to self and or others. One of the fundamental rules governing that balance is that it wants to remain level. So with any deviation from neutrality, the brain will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what's called homeostasis. Mm-hmm. You have to imagine that in your brain there's a balance, like a teeter-totter in the playground. When we experience pleasure, the balance tips one way. When we experience pain, it tips the other. One of the fundamental rules governing that balance is that it wants to remain level. With any deviation from neutrality, the brain will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what's called homeostasis. Mm-hmm. Really an addiction. It can devastate lives. People can lose their lives over these problems. And it's not just about, polyamory should be socially accepted. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a compulsive, out of control phenomenon that has very serious consequences for people. Yes, it's true that childhood trauma increases your risk for developing addiction. Yes, it's true that addiction leads to isolation and that the antidote to addiction is social connection in part. But what is so important to understand is you can have the perfect childhood, the perfect parents, the greatest social network, the best spouse, wonderful kids, and you can get really, really addicted. Addicted, 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 addicted.
There's alcoholism, there's drug addiction. There are some qualitative differences between substance addiction and behavioral addictions. And now that we're in this world where everything has an addictive allure to it, do you qualify our relationship with our devices and online shopping and gambling in the same way? Like with this idea of addiction being a spectrum, how does it differ in terms of like our relationship to Twitter versus our relationship to heroin?
I don't really see all that much difference between those things. I think it's just a matter of degree. Obviously, when we're talking about heroin, we're talking about the physiologic dependence and withdrawal as well, which I do think happens with behavioral addictions to things like Twitter. I believe we can have a true physiologic dependence and withdrawal to those behaviors, but not to the same degree as with something like an opioid. But in terms of the psychological aspect of the attachment, I think it's very, very similar. And I believe that because I've seen so many people come through my office who are addicted to things like gaming, gambling, pornography, shopping, addicted, 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 addicted.